I think I heard the children who used to come every Sunday, I think they were louder than the adults, so now I know who the culprits are, who don't answer. So it's the little ones who do answer. Okay, everyone who's hiding at the back, so come in front, because I think the speaker would like to see you personally rather than facing this way. And no one is old, so you don't need the back, the wall anyway. So I would like you to come as much in front as possible. So when the more people come in, they can easily go at the back. So please come in front. I have another way of asking you how to come in front. You want me to try that? No? I saw somebody doing that. They asked everyone to stand up, and they said, okay, take 2 steps, and now sit down. So I like that. Okay. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you very much. That's much better. Let's hear loud salawat, please. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad. I'd like to thank everyone who got out of their bed. Some of you did not have breakfast, some of you did. And it was one day you could sleep in, but hey, you know what? Tomorrow is a holiday, sleep in. That's no problem. You have one more day to enjoy. But I very much appreciate that the students of senior class as well as grade 6 have taken this session seriously, and they feel they wanted to learn, and they are here. That's a big difference. And I really, really appreciate that. And I can tell you, you will not regret coming here. You'll learn something that you can take it with you for the rest of your life. Okay? It's very important. I'd like to welcome Sheikh Salim Bimji, take this opportunity, and I asked him to do it, and he said, sure. He didn't even wink to say no, or I'll see, or let me think. So just to say that shows that he really wanted to be here even on a holiday when he wanted to sleep in too. I'd like to thank all the teachers who are here. Whoever were able to commit. I have some parents here. And I felt from the public that they felt that, how come you're not asking us to be here? But this program, we kept it exclusively for teachers who teach madrasa, as well as students. Okay, it's very important. So without further of my blabbering, I'd like to call Sheikh Salim. And before I do that, I would like you to make sure that you do write. At the end, we are going to collect everything. So if you think you're going to go home and type and bring it back, we have tried, it didn't work out very well. So we're going to make sure you write everything that he's saying so you know, and we will judge how you are listening, okay, at the same time. This will be reflecting on your report card as well. And Brother Ali Muslim and Brother Ali Zakir and Brother Sadiq are going to be testing you on these, so they'll let you know in the class when. Okay. Sorry. Okay. Yeah.
Assalamu alaikum. It is really very encouraging to see all the youths here, mashallah. I just wanted to give you some background of Sheikh Salim Bimji, but I know you do not want to know his academic background, because the academic background will just fly over your head and you won't be interested in it. He is an Edmontonian. He's lived his youth life in Edmonton. He's gone through junior high and high school in Edmonton. So, he can relate to you. And if you have any questions after the session, you're most welcome to discuss with him. But again, I just want to emphasize that he can relate to your challenges. He can relate to your questions of high school, junior high. So this is an opportunity that you do not get very often. So take this opportunity. You can talk to him after the session. Salawat. So now I'll call upon Sheikh Salim with a loud salawat. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad wa ajjal farajahum.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء وسيد المرسلين حبيبنا وحبيب قلوبنا أبي القاسم محمد اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد أما بعد رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. First off, I wanted to say Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh to all of you, and to thank you all for being here today on this very early Sunday morning. And hopefully the topic which was requested of me to speak about will be pertinent to all of you today. We want to basically look at what I've entitled Glimpses, a selection of major events in the life of the Prophet of Islam, the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wa alihi wasallam. And I have structured it such that I want to look at about 3 or 4 main topics about his life, but not just from a historical perspective. I know we all study history both in the public school system and also here within the madrasa system. And a lot of times we don't get the opportunity to look at it from an analytical point of view, that why did certain things happen in the life of the Prophet? And sometimes we become a bit perplexed when we even study the life of Rasulullah, because we see things within his life that don't necessarily fit with our understanding of life, or of issues that he was facing that perhaps today are a bit alien to us. And a lot of times even non-Muslims will come to us and they will raise accusations against the Prophet, and they will pick out certain portions of his life, which I want to hopefully look at today in somewhat detail. And they will accuse the Prophet of many different terms, many different things that they saw that he did in his life, and we don't necessarily have an answer to those things. So today, hopefully, I want to try to go through those points within the life of the Prophet, and ultimately end the discussion with what it is that we can do living in North America to be good ambassadors of the religion of Islam. So I'm going to structure the topic and the talk into about 4 sections, and rather than wait for the end of the entire presentation to entertain questions, what I would like to do is, after every section, I'll give you about maybe 5 to 7 minutes to think of some questions that may be coming into your mind about that topic. And we will discuss those at that particular time, and then we'll go on to the section after that. So, as the topic is a selection of major events in the life of the Holy Prophet, peace be upon him and his family. And as we mentioned that, he lived a 63-year life. 23 years of that were the official prophethood, so 40 years pre-prophethood, and then 23 years of the actual official invitation and call to Islam. And the areas I want to look at first are the major events in the life of the Prophet, and some of the accusations which are leveled against the Prophet, and how we can reply to them. And I will mention at the outset that I won't be able to do an exhaustive discussion on all of these topics, because really they would take hours or days to go through them in detail. I'll give you some indicators, and there'll be some references that you can go to later on. And perhaps if we have the ability at a later date, we can actually go into a more detailed discussion and look at all of these issues. Because there are definite answers we have from our scholars, from the books of literature, from the ulama who have written on the replies. But obviously today we don't really have the time to go into the depth of every single answer to all of the accusations against the Prophet and against the religion of Islam. I want to then end the discussion on the events by looking at some of the historical events and connect them to the issue of imamat, which, as we know, is a part of the usul ad-din. So we have 5 principles of the religion. We have the tawheed, the oneness of Allah. We have prophethood, which is nubuwat. We have qiyamat, which is the belief in the day of resurrection. And then we have 2 extra topics, which are actually offshoots. So we have adalat, the justice of Allah, which is really an offshoot of tawheed. And then we have imamat, which is an offshoot of nubuwat, imamat being the divinely appointed leadership of the Prophet of Islam. So I want to look at a few issues in regards to that specific area. And then ultimately I want to look at what we can do in our own era to help convey the correct message of Islam. Because as you know, and you'd have to be living in a vacuum to not understand that there are a lot of attacks against the religion of Islam. Majority of these are coming from outside of our religion, but unfortunately we have even people within the religion of Islam, within the framework of Islam, who launch attacks against the religion because of their own narrow-mindedness of the religion, or perhaps they are making a lot of money because it is a lucrative business to get into today. To write a book against Islam, especially if you're a Muslim, there's a lot of money involved in that. And unfortunately, we have people within our own communities, people who claim to follow Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam even, and Muslims of all different shades and colors who basically do this. They have a full-time profession in attacking the religion and bringing doubts into the minds of the believers. So I want to look at just some of the ways that we can basically try to be a good role model and ambassador for the religion and to try and convey a positive energy of the religion of Islam. So if I go to the first area, looking at the stages of life of the Prophet, basically we can break the life of Rasulullah up into 3 different stages as we see on the screen. We have the pre-announcement of prophethood, which as we know was from the birth of Rasulullah up until the time that he reached the age of 40. And within that period, let me just mention first off that as followers of Ahlul Bayt, we don't believe that the Prophet was not a prophet in that first 40 years. We have an understanding that he was always a prophet. He was created as a prophet. He was in the world of existence that came before this earthly existence, Allah had created him as a prophet. But that first 40 years, he didn't have an official proclamation, an official announcement to his prophethood. So he was a messenger, but he was not openly conveying the teachings of the religion. That was basically a stage in his life that came after 40 years. So that first 40 years, although he was a prophet of Allah, he was recognized by Allah as being the Nabi and the final of the prophets, but he didn't have an open calling to the religion. So that first 40 years is the pre-announcement of prophethood, where he was basically building up his character, building up his status within the society. And then from there we have the Meccan period, which is that first 13 years. So when the Prophet reached the age of 40, and he begins to receive the revelation, that period from the beginning of revelation until he has to leave Mecca and migrate to Medina is known as the Meccan period. And that is a period of about 13 years. That period of the life of the Prophet was obviously one of great difficulty because he was beginning the prophetic mission. He was receiving verses of the Quran. He was conveying that to the people in Mecca, mostly all, or if not all of them, who were at one time or another polytheists, people who did not believe in a God or who believed in multiple gods. And he was beginning to try and change their religious understanding, to change their belief system, to relook at how they understood the concept of religion. And obviously that was a very difficult time for the Prophet because just imagine that he is having to change a group of people who for hundreds, maybe if not thousands of years had believed in worshiping of stone idols, who had done actions which were the most horrendous of actions. I mean, the Quran, when you look at the pre-Islamic period or even the Meccan period, it was a time when, for example, women had no rights. The Quran talks about how even when a woman would give birth or when a child was born, and if it was a girl, a majority of the tribes, not all of the Arab tribes, but a majority of the tribes would actually bury the girl alive. And there's a historical significance why they would do that. But they used to bury the girls alive because they felt it brought about shame. They were worried that if there was ever a war and she was captured, that it would bring great grief to the family. So they would actually bury their female children alive, a term which we call infanticide. And that's not something that was only then. Even till today, that act actually continues in many cultures around the world. So the Prophet was trying to eradicate a lot of these teachings which were anti-human teachings, whether it be the treatment of women, the killing of children, the buying and selling of free people as slaves, whether it be the wars that used to last for generations. There were wars that were waged amongst the Arab tribes because somebody 10 generations previously had done something wrong, and the families carried a grudge for generations and generations. So the Prophet in that first 13-year period was also trying to remove those sorts of backwards mentalities within the people. Also, we know that within that 13-year period, one of the things that the Prophet tried to eradicate, and he was very successful in doing it, was things like racial discrimination. So you had a society of people who felt that they were better than people of a different skin tone. People who were of an African origin, for example, were treated with contempt within society. People who were not of the Arab lineage were not favored. They weren't looked upon as being as even equal human beings. So a lot of these things that we take perhaps for granted today are things that the Prophet began to fight against in that initial 13-year stage in Mecca. And obviously a lot of the religious teachings were also coming down. Some of the ahkam of Islam, for example, about praying was being instituted. That was one of the main actions. And so this 13-year period of the Prophet was where he was trying to build up the believers, build up their theological base, try to build them up as strong believers within this new religion, and to understand the verses of the Quran that were being revealed to the Prophet. We then go to the third stage of the life of the Prophet, which is where a lot of the attacks that we see today come onto the religion of Islam. And that is, as we know, when the Prophet made the migration from Mecca to Medina, that he established what is known as the first Muslim state. So he became the head of state when they moved to the city called Yathrib, which was later named as Madinatul Nabi, or Medina for short. That he became the head of the state. He became basically the principal architect of this new religious and Islamic society. So not only was it a theoretical concept that was in Mecca, because Mecca was just all theory and a little bit of practice in terms of the praying and the internal acts of worship, but when they get to Medina is actually where we're able to now see the Prophet putting all of the religion's teachings and whatever is coming to him into a practical application. So for example, the fasting of the month of Ramadan is instituted when we get to Medina. The call for self-defense, protection of the life of the Muslims was not allowed in Mecca. It was only until they got to Medina where now the Muslims were allowed to protect themselves and to actually fight a war to defend their honor and their territory. So a lot of the teachings that we see are being attacked today about the Prophet, about himself and his character, and also of the religion, are basically an offshoot from what was happening within the city of Medina. And so really that is where we almost need to look to when we want to understand what the attacks are against the Prophet. It's to focus on the Medinan period and to see what was happening in Medina, historically speaking, and in the life of Rasulullah, and then from there to basically understand how to counter these arguments and discussions against the Prophet. So the three areas that I want to look at in terms of critiques against the Prophet are basically as follows. The one is we want to look at the issue of waging wars. Today, as you, I'm sure, come across from websites, from discussions on many different forums, is where they accuse Islam as being a religion which was spread by the sword. And they say that Islam was, basically conquering nations through war and bloodshed and killing. And they'll say that, the Prophet fought in this many battles, and these are, and they'll basically make our Prophet to be some sort of warmonger. And in contrast, they'll say, well, if you look at Jesus, for example, the Christians, they'll say, well, Jesus was a Prince of Peace, as they call him, and that he didn't fight, that he said, turn the other cheek, that he said, love thy enemy. And they'll bring up all of these biblical quotations and excerpts from the life of Jesus to contrast his life with that of the life of the Prophet. And they'll say that if you look at the two, they'll say, well, Jesus didn't fight, he didn't kill people, he didn't engage in war and bloodshed, but the Prophet of Islam did. So we have to have at least one level of understanding why there is a difference between these two prophets, and also what makes the Prophet of Islam and his religion different than all the other religions and traditions that Allah had previously sent down to humanity for their guidance. The second thing I want to look at are the multiple wives of the Prophet. As we know, if you look in the historical references, that the Prophet married more than one. He actually had at one time up to 9 wives. And in total, he had, apparently, according to some historians, up to 13 wives in total within his life. And so a lot of non-Muslims and Muslims alike will bring up this accusation that your Prophet was marrying women non-stop. And he was marrying women, as they say, apparently as young as 9 years old. So what do we have as a reply to this? Again, I won't be able to go into the depth of these, but I will, hopefully after the program, leave references with the principal that you can go to, both audio lectures and also articles, that will give us more knowledge on how to counter these attacks against the Prophet. And third and lastly, what we want to look at in terms of the critique against the Prophet is the appointment of a successor. This is actually, when you look at the entire world of Islam, this is perhaps the most determining factor amongst all the different groups within Islam, whether you be Shia or Sunni or Ismaili or Bahara or whatever group of Islam we have today. The principal reason we can say why we have all the differences in terms of the Muslim community is on the successorship of the Prophet. That did he actually leave a successor after him? Or was it something that the Prophet didn't think about or that Allah did not deem to be important enough to give to the community? And if it wasn't important enough for Allah to give us direction, then what makes us as Muslims think that we need to go in this route? So we want to try to look at these three areas of discussion and see what we can actually understand and what we can actually take back with us to be for ourselves to think about and to actually affirm and strengthen our own belief and conviction. But also when we have those accusations coming against us, or we see in the media these attacks coming against our religion, what we have to reply to such words of hatred really against the religion, and many times not even hatred, but just an unawareness on the part of those people who are raising these accusations against us. So the first thing that I want to look at is the topic of waging wars. And as we mentioned that the Prophet, he is accused, and the religion of Islam itself is being accused as a religion of war, a religion that was spread by the sword, a religion of violence, something which is not seen in other religions as we are told from their point of view. So what actually is the basis of this? Was Islam spread by the sword? Is it a religion which condones indiscriminate killing? And obviously after September 11th, we know that the pressure was even more upon Muslims because they saw the actions of some people and they interpreted that to be that was a religious approval, that there was religious approval to do those actions. Or whether you look at any of the other terrorist attacks that have happened in North America, in Europe, in the Middle East, all of these always seem to come back to the root that they say that the religion and the Quran is condoning and approving of these sorts of actions. So how do we understand the life of the Prophet and this attack against his character? Well, the one thing that we have to appreciate looking at Islam in relation to all other religions, especially Christianity and Judaism, because they being what the Quran calls the people of the book, people who have been given a divine scripture, is that all other religions were of a temporary nature. All other teachings, rather, that were given were of a temporary nature. So with the teachings of Prophet Moses, let's say, or the teachings of Prophet Ibrahim or Prophet Jesus, or any of the other prophets which are mentioned in the Quran or prophets mentioned in the Bible, their teachings were of a temporary nature. They were limited to a certain group of people. They were limited to a certain geographic region. But we see with the religion of Islam, the way that Allah has presented it is that it is not just for a particular group of people or a particular time, but it is universal in its teachings. And being universal means that it has to have influence and an impact on every aspect of the life of a human being. And so when you look at the life of the Prophet, you see that he, for example, married, he had children, he would lead an average normal day-to-day life. And one of those parts of his life was to establish an Islamic state, an Islamic government, a state where the Muslims would be free to practice the religion, would be free to have that security and safety as Muslims. This isn't necessarily seen in other religions. For example, in Christianity, Jesus was never commanded to establish a Christian state. He was bringing teachings, definitely, but his teachings were more of an ethical nature, of a moral nature. So when Jesus talks about, and whether his teachings are scattered within the Bible, or even in the Hadith, because we have even compilations of books today which feature Hadith of Prophet Jesus from the Shia Imams, we see that a majority, if not all of the teachings of Jesus deal with an ethical nature. They're about how to treat fellow human beings. They're not about how to pray or how to fast or giving in charity, although he did these things, but these weren't necessarily direct teachings that Jesus was giving to his community. So he was basically building upon what Prophet Moses had brought and all the previous prophets had brought before him. So their teachings were not of a universal nature. It wasn't established. Christianity was not, if you want to call it as a religion, but he was just following what came before him. But these new teachings were not meant to be to form a state, let's say, or a government. But with the Prophet of Islam, what we understand is that his religion, what he was bringing of Islam, which was a completion of the previous teachings, was something which was going to basically not only stand the test of time, but be a set of teachings for all aspects of life. So the Quran, for example, would bring about verses about economic policy. There were verses of the Quran about the social structure of a society. There were verses about the political nature of how you run a government. Very general, but obviously the application done by the Prophet. And so Islam basically was being a religion founded upon an establishment of an order upon the earth, an establishment of government and a system which would basically be there for everybody. And therefore, when we look at the life of the Prophet, as you mentioned, when we break it up into those three stages, we have the first 40 years of the life of the Prophet where there were no wars, no fighting that the Prophet was involved in. And as we mentioned, that first 40-year phase of the life of Rasulullah was just for him to build up his personality, to build up his character, and to basically show the people who he was. And we know that if you've studied the life of the Prophet, that he was known by two specific names as he was growing up. Does anybody know what those two names were that the Prophet was known by? Two different titles that were given to the Prophet very early in his life. Yes? Sure. Yes, correct. Okay. Does anybody remember the second one? He said As-Sadiq, which is correct. Yes. Al-Amin, yes, perfect. So this initial phase, the Prophet was building up his character. And so he was actually given the title of As-Sadiq, the truthful one, and Al-Amin, the one who was trustworthy. So this phase was, again, there was no official call to Islam, but here still the Prophet was basically building up his character to show the people that when he was about to proclaim the religion, that they would know him as a trustworthy person, as one who would not tell lies, who would be always honest and fair whenever it would, whenever it involved him, whether it be in his benefit or even in his harm, against his own interests. So the first 40 years, there was no fighting, no wars, nothing that the Prophet was engaged in at that particular way. And then obviously the revelation begins at the age of 40. The Prophet is now told to openly proclaim the religion of Islam. He's openly told to begin to teach the Quran. And that 13-year period in Mecca is basically that beginning formative phase of the Muslim community. But even here, even though there were attacks against the Prophet, even though there were attacks against the early believers, still the Prophet was prohibited from fighting, from attacking the people who were attacking him. And we have even examples in the history where the Prophet would be in Mecca and he would be praying in the Kaaba, and people would come and throw things upon him. They would throw, for example, the excrement of an animal or the internal organs of an animal upon him while he was praying. And he was still not allowed to act in any way to, repel these enemies in any sort of physical force. There's also stories about people who would throw rocks at the Prophet, who would insult him, who would call him names. And still, all of these attacks against the character of the Prophet in that first 13 years, he was basically told to bear all of the difficulties with patience and basically, to just bear all of these challenges. So 13 years, and it was a time of growth, of planning, of strategizing, and it was not a time for the believers to even defend themselves really in any way. So they basically had to deal with the difficulties that they were going through and basically wait for the time that Allah would now permit them to actually enact a concept of self-defense. So again, 13 years of Islam, and there are no wars fought, no altercations happen. Even when the Muslims are excommunicated and removed from Mecca, and they're moved into this area which is known as the Valley of Abu Talib, still there are no ways that the Prophet and the believers can actually begin to fight against the non-believers. But then you come to the period in Medina, which is that last 10-year period of the life of the Prophet. And we see that in that 10 years, the Prophet and the believers had to fight about 27 different battles. Now, some of these are major battles like Badr, like Uhud, like Khandak, Khaybar. These are the major, we've heard all these names, I'm sure. And these are the major battles that were going on, which the Prophet was actually physically present in those particular events. But then you also have many minor battles and skirmishes that would have happened at that time. Whether the Prophet was there or not, if he wasn't there, he would have appointed somebody to be the head of the battalion. But in total, in these 27 battles, we are told that there are only about 202 people who were killed in total in all these battles. And there's a link that I've kept there, and again, we'll get this PowerPoint out to everybody. But there's an article which was on a website called Veterans Today. It's a website for people who are war veterans, mostly from the American point of view. And they have an article entitled, "Who Killed More, Muhammad or NATO?" And it's an interesting read if you go into it, because, and I'm sure just by going through public school, you'll realize that in the battles that we have seen within the last 100 years, whether it be World War I, World War II, the Vietnam War, and most recently the wars in Iraq and the attacks in Afghanistan, and so many other places in the world, but especially those which are launched by NATO and this this world force that they keep referring it as, the international community. Probably the numbers of people killed are in the tens, if not hundreds of millions, if not even more than that. And that is also one indication that religion is not an issue here, right? That people who say that the Prophet was responsible for wars and killing, yes, there were wars that happened at the time of the Prophet, and yes, people were killed, but the sheer numbers are staggering when you compare the two. And inshallah, when we see that why those wars were even fought and what the Prophet laid down in terms of the rules of engagement are completely different than what we probably see in the world today. So again, that period was one in which the believers were finally given the right to defend themselves, to protect their honor, to protect their property. And this actually became a legislation from a verse of the Quran. In chapter 22, which is Surah Al-Hajj, verse 39, Allah gives the permission for the believers now to basically engage in warfare. And as the verse says, it says, أُذِنَ لِلَّذِينَ يُقَاتَلُونَ بِأَنَّهُمْ ظُلِمُوا وَإِنَّ اللَّهَ عَلَى نَصْرِهِمْ لَقَدِيرٌ. That those who are fought against, meaning the Muslims, are now permitted to fight because they have been wronged. And God is indeed able to help them. So finally, the Muslims were given the permission to defend themselves, to safeguard their homeland, to protect their own rights and property and honor. Again, this was something which was not in Mecca. This was not allowed in Mecca. They had to be patient. They had to go through the difficulties. And it was only when they moved to Medina that Allah now gives the permission for the Muslims to defend themselves, to launch wars, to launch defensive wars, basically. And basically this is where we see the turning point in the religion, and this is where we see a lot of the accusations that come up against Muslims in relation to these wars that were being fought at that particular time. But as I mentioned, that the wars that the Prophet fought and the way that the Prophet interacted on the battlefront are much different than what we see even today. Even though we have groups like United Nations and you have NATO and you have the Geneva Convention, which apparently outlines how prisoners of war and how wars have to be fought. But we don't see a lot of that being put into practice. And a clear example of that is what we see in America with Guantanamo Bay, that people were captured from Afghanistan under the pretext that they were fighting against the Americans. They're shipped in what they call a rendition to Guantanamo Bay in Cuba. And now for almost 12 years, there's still people who are kept in detention there with no charges. They're not charged with anything illegal. There's no due course of the law for them. They're just in limbo, waiting in perhaps for infinity, maybe. Only Allah knows how long they will be in that state. And so we see that in these issues in today's day and age, that these countries that claim to have human rights and who claim to follow the Geneva Convention and who claim to be following rule of law with warfare, that when it suits them, they obviously do not follow the same rules that have been laid down on an international level. But with the Prophet, we see something completely different. And I'm just going to give you 3 of the examples of the unique features of the battles of the Prophet and when he used to fight a war. which again we don't see today, but which was clearly laid down by the Prophet. One is that when it came to wars, that the Prophet never waged a war in order to expand the Muslim territories. So it wasn't that the Prophet would conquer a neighboring country just to expand the Muslim frontier. Now, that doesn't mean that it didn't happen, because we know that after the death of the Prophet, we had some people who came up who claimed to be the khulafa after the Prophet, who claimed to be successors of the Prophet, and they indeed did launch wars and spread Islam through the sword. That is undeniable fact of history. But we say that from the point of view of the teachings of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam, we don't accept those individuals who fought those wars and who conquered territories to be fighting a Islamic battle. They were doing it for a personal motive or what they thought to be a religious mandate, but it was never instructed by the Quran that you can go and to conquer a town or conquer a country and force the people to convert to Islam by the sword. That was never a teaching of the Quran or the way of Rasulullah. So when the Prophet was engaged in any battle, most of them, if not all of them, were to basically protect the Muslim country. It was to ensure that the borders of the Muslim region were safe, were protected. And it was never just to go to a neighboring country to attack them, to take their resources, or to capture the people and enslave them. It was never done in that particular way. So that is one of the unique features of the battles of Islam that we see that the Prophet had basically been instructed to implement within his life. The second thing we see is that all of the battles of the Prophet were defensive and again aimed at protecting the lives and the property of the Muslims and the innocent people. So keeping in mind again that the Prophet, yes, he was a prophet for Islam, that he was bringing this religion called Islam, but at the same time, he still safeguarded the rights of the minorities within their society. So there were Christians, for example, in Medina. There were Jews in Medina who did not convert to Islam. And there were Jewish tribes around Medina as well who remained on their religion. And the Prophet never forced them to convert. They stayed on their religion, but they were given protection under an Islamic code known as basically as the jizya, which was a tax that non-Muslims would give to the Islamic State in return for protection. Sometimes people will say, well, this jizya, this tax, is a form of an insult against the non-Muslims. But actually how we understand it is just as Muslims, we know that we have things like khums, we have zakat to give to the Islamic State. The Jews and Christians obviously would not pay khums and zakat. And so what would happen is that the Prophet and the rightful successors of the Prophet would basically say that because you don't give these religious taxes, you have a different tax to give, but that tax basically will now guarantee that if you are ever attacked, that the Muslim army would come and defend and protect you. So basically it was a form of an income tax or a tax given to them that would ensure that they would be given safety and security and that their property would be safeguarded by the Muslim community. So again, when the Prophet fought any of these battles, it was basically done to protect the community, not only the Muslim community, but also the non-Muslims who were living under the protection of Islam. And thirdly, what we see as one of the unique identifiers of the battles of the Prophet is he fought with justice. Right? And it sounds a bit strange, how do you fight with justice? But you have to appreciate that at that time that the Prophet was living in, there were no conventions of war, first of all. So people were really free to do whatever they wanted to in times of war. But the Prophet ensured that everything he did in war was rational, it was not immoral, it was not unethical. And even today we have teachings of the Prophet where he tells us how to engage in combat. For example, we're told that to pollute the water or to poison the water of the enemy army is a prohibition. We're not allowed to poison the water. Something that we see happening even today, unfortunately, in parts of the Middle East, where the one side will actually contaminate and pollute the drinking water of the other side, just to be out of vengeance and spitefulness. The Prophet even said to cut down trees was prohibited during the time of war. Right? Again, it's something that you see today. If you look at the Middle East, and especially within the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, you see that day after day after day, the Israeli forces will come and chop down groves of olive trees and other kinds of trees that are providing shade and vegetation. Again, a clear commandment that the Prophet said at times of war that was not allowed, it was prohibited. But today we see that being done in many parts of the world. And even when it came to the issue of slaves, and yes, Islam at one way, it permitted slavery, but it was doing it to eradicate slavery at a slow, gradual process. That where Islam said that if you capture a slave, for example, which I believe happened in the Battle of Badr, the Prophet would say that if you have captured a slave and the slave wants to become freed, if they teach 10 Muslims how to read and write, they would be freed. So there was always a methodology within Islam to eliminate slavery. And the Prophet brought ways to do this. Again, something that you look at Guantanamo Bay, or you look at other parts of the world, when they capture people and put them in prisons, they don't have that same level of teaching and of ethical teachings that the Prophet had. Now you might say, well, today there is no slavery. And to an extent, yes, there is no slavery. But also when you look at places, again, like Guantanamo Bay or the prison system, even in the world in general, the prisons are a form of slavery. I mean, there are parts in the United States of America, for example, in Louisiana, which has one of the largest prisons in the United States. And really the entire city is a prison. They have their own hospital, their own fire department, their own stores there. And the prisoners who are there serving time in this maximum penitentiary prison, they'll, for example, work in the field in this particular prison, and they'll earn 10, 15, 20 cents an hour to work in 30, 35, 40-degree weather. And this is in 2013. This is not 1,000 years ago. This is today. It happens in America. And with that 10 cents an hour or 20 cents an hour that they get, they have to buy their own soap, their own shampoo, their own underclothes, their own toothpaste, their own toothbrush. So it may take them 40 hours of working to buy one tube of toothpaste, right? That is a form of slavery. That is 21st century slavery happening in America today. But again, it's not talked about in the media. It's not exposed, but it is a form of slavery that is happening even till today. So the Prophet, he brought rules of engagement. He brought even a way to deal with prisoners of war. They weren't to be treated as second-class citizens. In fact, the prophetic teachings told us that if you had a slave and you were working to free them, you had to feed them the same food that you eat. Right? You couldn't just say, okay, well, the scraps that are left over is what you would feed to the prisoner. No, they were actually entitled to the same food that you were eating. And so the Prophet brought all of these teachings, and these were basically unique factors of the times of the wars that the Prophet had to fight and he had to go through. But in addition to waging these wars, we see that the Prophet was also, at the same time, he was also waging what we call waging peace. So he basically was not only defending the Muslim community against all these attacks from various angles, he was also trying to lay down a constitution of what would entail to be a peaceful society. And there's a document which is mentioned in many of the books. It is called the Constitution of Medina. And it's about 40 or 45 points in which the Prophet had outlined a charter of what would be the constitution of the new Islamic state. And in essence, basically, it was formulated to forge an understanding amongst the tribes of Medina and the surrounding area. And that included the Muslims, the Jews, the Christians, and even the non-Muslims, those who did not actually accept any creation or any creator. And again, the Constitution is very long. We can have the details sent out, but it actually established a lot of things that we perhaps take for granted today. Things that even you see within, let's say, United Nations Charter was drafted by the Prophet 1,400 years ago within this document. So he talked about the religious freedoms. Again, today we think that if Islam was spread by the sword, if that statement is true, then there should have not been any Jews in Medina or in that surrounding area. There should not have been any Christians within that area. But we know, for example, historically speaking, that when the Battle of Khaybar happened, that Khaybar was a fortress which was part of the Jewish community. So that means that there were still Jews within that region that were not acting, that the Prophet was not basically attacking or trying to convert over by the sword. In addition, you guys, I'm sure, know about the event of Mubahila, right, which is where the Christians of Najran came to debate with the Prophet about the divinity of Jesus. had Islam spread by the sword, then you would not have seen Christians in Najran, which is in the southern half of the Arabian Peninsula near the area of Yemen. You wouldn't have Christians coming from there to Medina to debate with the Prophet. But showing that by seeing these events, we realize that the Prophet allowed religious freedoms to be there. He didn't, for example, kill the people of other religions because they didn't accept Islam. And in fact, we have books which are available today which actually highlight and quote every single letter and message that the Prophet wrote to all the different regions of the world. There's a 3-volume book in Arabic called Maqatib al-Rasul, which basically, it's a compilation of every single letter that was written, dictated by the Prophet, which his scribes have written, and which basically he wrote to all the different empires around the world at that particular time, inviting them to Islam and giving them the guidance and the good news of his prophethood. So this shows us again that the Prophet was actively working at a peaceful way to bring people into the religion. He wasn't going and conquering them one by one to bring them to Islam. He was using dialogue, discussion, and inviting them to Islam through peaceful means. Also, the Constitution of Medina permitted and actually granted asylum to people who were seeking protection. And this actually is a Quranic mandate that even in the time of a war, the Quran mentions that if an enemy force comes and they want to hear about Islam, Allah says in the Quran that give them respite, give them some time to come and hear the message of Islam, and then for them to decide what they want to do. So the Medina Constitution also allowed this safe haven for people. If they needed asylum from whatever they were going through, or if they wanted to just come and hear about Islam and maybe then decide whether they wanted to accept or reject it, they were given this opportunity at that time to use Medina as that safe ground for them to come and hear of the message of the Prophet. And the third point we mentioned is about the security of women. Again, in a time when women were not looked upon favorably in the Arab society, the Prophet granted women the right to lead a normal life. Obviously, there are differences and limitations in the way that men and women interact in a society. But the Prophet basically broke a lot of the the pre-Islamic religious traditions that were there in relation to women and gave them a status which up until that point was really not there within the Arabian society. Before I go to the next section, I just want to stop here for a few minutes, and if there's any questions or comments on this first portion in terms of the wars and the treatment or the war and peace of the Prophet, then we'll take maybe about 5 minutes to go through those questions, please. Yes. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Otherwise, we will still be Ottomans.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And I have heard it many times. I tried my best to convince them, but what would be the best answer?
So, like I mentioned that, after the death of the Prophet, many things happened definitely that we don't condone from the point of view of Muslims. So, for example, if the Khulafa went on campaigns to convert other regions to Islam, I think we can say that those were not done under an Islamic mandate. So, for example, if they did it, it was from their understanding of the religion, it was what they thought was the right way. But the Quran never made it. The Quran doesn't show us, and the Prophet's example, and even how our Imams Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam, how they have explained it to us. They have never shown us that what happened and those sorts of campaigns, that they were ever condoned by the religion, right? And even to the extent where that, basically, that those actions were done by individuals on their own understanding, not that the Quran would ever have sanctioned them to go to Iran or go to to Western regions in Africa or wherever else to bring the religion. If they did it, and the people accepted Islam, that is a different issue, but religiously speaking, that they were never given a mandate, let's say from the Quran itself, or from the ways of the Prophet, that would have allowed them to do that. Right. So going and giving a message is one thing. So for example, just giving da'wah, right? Teaching the people of the religion, saying that this is Islam, and here are the teachings, and letting them decide is one thing, which is acceptable within any religion. But actually forcing people to convert is a different issue altogether, right? That is something which even the Quran makes it clear that you can't compel a people to believe. There's no force within acceptance of a religion. You can give a message and then hope that they will accept it, but anything other than that is I think stepping over the boundaries of what the religion would allow.
What I'm trying to say is that they criticize Muslims.
Mm-hmm.
Type of people, they say that it didn't happen.
Mm-hmm.
So why should we be Muslims now?
Mm-hmm.
Now that we understand that it was a wrong action from
Yeah.
the second Khalifa, why should we still be Muslims? Why do we care about Islam? This is
Mm-hmm.
the argument. Why
Okay.
we should not be even Muslims because we became Muslims under the Prophet.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
What would be the answer to that?
So people are free to leave. People are free to leave the religion if they feel that because they were conquered by the second Khalifa, that they are now Muslims because of that. Then there's some deficiency in their own Islam and their own Iman. If they don't have that firm conviction that they're Muslims and there's a benefit in Islam, that it gives them a benefit in this world and the next world, then they're free to leave the religion, generally speaking. But it would be a very weak argument, for them to say that, because again, they're not compelled to come into the religion. They can just as plain leave the religion. But that goes for really all of us, right? Even all of those who are born into a Muslim family, whether they be from India or Pakistan or Afghanistan. If you're born into a Muslim family, you're not. Technically, you are a Muslim because your parents are a Muslim. But a point comes in your life where you have to accept it on your own, right? And that's why we have the madrasa, and that's why we teach and we learn about religion, because we need to accept it on our own understanding, right? I can't stand up and say I'm a Muslim because my mother and father are Muslim. Well, that won't help me on the day of judgment, right? Allah will say, well, and the Quran gives this argument so many times that, do you believe just because your forefathers believed? Looking at it from the negative point of view, but also from the Islamic point of view, we can't just say that we're Muslims and we follow Ahlul Bayt because our parents did it, right? So anybody who is a Muslim today, if they haven't accepted Islam on their own, then there is some level of deficiency within their conviction in Iman that we have to work on to get over that hurdle. Yeah. Any other questions on this first section? Nothing else? So we'll go to the second section now, which is on the wives of the Prophet. And not only the multiple wives that he had, but also the ages of his wives. Again, when you look at, and if you want to compare and contrast Islam to, let's say, Christianity, because that is obviously the dominant religion in the world today, both Islam and Christianity are the dominant forces, they will say, well, Jesus, he didn't even marry, right? He led a celibate life. And if you look at some of the parts of the Christian church, like the Catholic Church, their priests don't marry because they believe it takes them away from the remembrance of God. But when they look at the life of a prophet, they'll say, well, he married, he had children. And yes, he married, he had children. He had multiple wives at many times in his life. The ages of his wives were radically different in some cases compared to his own age. But one of the things, before I go to the religious point of view and from the arguments of our scholars, is that we also have to appreciate that life in Mecca and Medina 1400 years ago, in Arabia in general, and actually even in the world in general, life at that time is not like life is today, right? Things were radically different back then. Not only the time that they were living in, but even the climate of that area, right? The climate, the heat of the region, it was different, and so it affected people in different ways. So why did the Prophet have multiple wives? Or why was Islam even allowing this, let's say, at the very first level? So we know that, first off, that pre-Islamic Arabia and their culture in relation to women was something which was not something which was obviously acceptable by the Prophet and by Allah in the teachings of the Quran. And what was actually happening is that women were treated like animals. They were treated like a commodity that you go and buy and sell in the market. So in pre-Islamic Arabia, a man could have 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 wives. They could be wives, they could be slaves that he owned, that he was free to do with whatever he wanted. The historical books even mention that if a man was married and he passed away, his son would actually inherit his mother as his own wife. Right? So it was a culture which was steeped in confusion. It was not respecting of the rights. So a woman was just a commodity. Just as you go into the market and you buy and sell, this is how they treated women at that time. So a man could have as many wives as he wanted. He could do with them whatever he wanted. And what Islam came to do at one level was to regulate the life of the society. Not only at that time, 1400 years ago, but because Islam is a universal religion for all time, it sought to bring really normalcy to entire life of humanity. Even though perhaps some of the rulings would not be applicable at certain times or in certain regions, but it basically brought a universal set of teachings and said that these are the parameters that as Muslims we are allowed to work within, and we're not allowed to basically go past that particular boundary. So one of the main verses of the Quran where people will say, well, Islam allows multiple marriages, that Islam will allow a man to have more than one wife. This is one of the verses of the Quran where Allah speaks about this. In chapter number 4, which is Surah Nisa, the chapter of the women, verse number 3. And it talks about how Allah says that if you fear that you may not deal justly with the orphans in terms of marrying them, then Allah says, then marry other women that you like, 2, 3, or 4. But if you fear that you may not treat them fairly, then marry only one. Or marry among your slave women. That makes it likelier that you will not be unfair. So Allah gave us a general understanding that a man was allowed to take on more than one wife, up to a maximum of 4. But He also made it clear in the Quran that if you feel that you could not be fair with them, then Allah says only one wife would be permitted for that individual. So Allah made it clear that there was a maximum limit that you could work within, but that there were conditions for that sort of a marriage. And if those conditions are not met, not only 1400 years ago, but even in today's day and age, if those conditions are not met, then Allah says only marry one. This is actually what we see reflective even in the life of the Prophet, in terms of him taking more than one wife. And it wasn't till much later in his life. From the historical perspective, we know that the Prophet married Khadija alayhi salam when he was 25 years old. There is a difference of opinion how old she is. Most of the Shia ulama say that she was 28 years old. Most of the non-Shia say that she was up to 40 years old. And there are different arguments on both sides and historical arguments of how old she actually was. I won't obviously go into all those debates and historical arguments, but we do see that if at 25, which is still a pretty young age to get married, the Prophet only had that one wife for about 25 years. So the entire time that he was married to her in Mecca, he didn't take on a second, third, or fourth wife, although he had, we could say, the ability or the right to do it according to Arab culture at the time. But we see that for 25 years, from the 25 until he was 50 years old, till he actually moves to Medina, he's only with Khadija alayhi salam. And this shows us at the one level that when people bring the accusation that your Prophet was marrying multiple women and he was engaged in this relationship in this way for ulterior motives that they say he had, well, we can reply and say when he was at his prime in his youth, when he had the ability, he had the societal right to do so, he was only married to one woman for that particular time period for 25 years. And when we look at the next part, we see that he did marry more than one woman, that it was for other reasons. It was for many different reasons that the Prophet basically married women from other, multiple wives, and for specific reasons that he actually entered into such marriages. So some of the reasons why we have that the Prophet married, and again, we're keeping in mind that there is a stark contrast, obviously, between Christianity and Islam and other religions, especially in this area. But because Islam is a universal religion, it is for all time, we see that the norms of Islam may not necessarily fit with the norms of the society that we're in today. And there's nothing wrong with that. That just means that we have a different understanding of what human norms should be, and the society that we live in today has a different understanding of what normal life is. And it's also interesting to note that, by people that say that, well, Muslims, you have 2, 3, or 4 wives, that this is not a religious mandate. It is not an obligation on a Muslim man to have more than one wife. Right? It is an option which is available if a need is there within society. But there are Christians today, there are Christians in Canada today, who it is a part of their religion to have more than one wife. For example, even in British Columbia, there's a case happening in a city called Bountiful in British Columbia, where there's a Christian sect, and it is a religious mandate to have more than one wife. There's a show on YouTube with Oprah Winfrey, and she actually interviews a family like this, where there's a husband and a wife, and the wife married the husband on the condition that he would marry more than one wife. A very traditional Christian, devout Christian family. And they interviewed both wives and the way that they lived together. But the point that I'm getting at is that for them it is a religious obligation within their faith of Christianity to marry more than one woman. But Islam looks at it the other way, that it is allowed if there is a need within society, and if there is an ability to be fair and just with the wives. And we see that in the life of the Prophet, that is what he did. And again, it was for multiple reasons. Some of the proofs that we have that why the Prophet married more than one, and it was not only for a sexual reason, that it was for a altruistic motive. He was doing something not for his own personal benefit, because again, had he wanted to, he would have done that when he was young, 25, 26. He could have married multiple women at that time. But when he moves to Medina, after the death of Khadija alayhi salam, that is where the Prophet is within this situation within his life. So some of the proofs, again, is that had he wanted to marry more than one, and had it been for personal benefit, he would have done so in Mecca. He wouldn't have waited till Medina. He had the opportunity. He was young. The Arab culture at that time allowed it, so it wouldn't have been looked upon in a negative light. He would have easily have done that. So that is one of the things that we should reflect on, is that if we're asked this question, we need to remember that the life of the Prophet in Mecca, he never went through this part of his life where he actually had more than one wife. Had he wanted to do it for personal benefit, he would have chosen many young women, very young, unmarried women who are not previously married. But we know that when you look at the lives, the ages of the wives, rather, of the Prophet, although there were some of a younger age, a lot of them were old women, people who were widows, and some of them who only lived 2 or 3 years after they married the Prophet. Women who were, for example, widowed in a time of a war. Their husbands were killed. Nobody else within the Muslim society in Medina were willing to marry that woman, to take care of them, to provide them for their needs. And so the Prophet married these sorts of women. There were some young women obviously also in there, but again, that when we look at in the next slide of why the Prophet married them. But on a whole, we can basically say that had he wanted to, had it been for personal gain, that he would have chosen the youngest women of the society if that was what he was looking for. But he didn't do that because it was not just a marriage out of, just for the pleasure aspect, but it was for actually many other reasons that he was entering into these marriages. The women, or the wives rather, of the Prophet, as we know, are known as, in the Quran, Allah says that the wives of the Prophet are Ummul Mu'mineen, Ummahatul Mu'mineen, that they are the mothers of the believers. And what this means at one level is that for a woman to marry the Prophet, once the Prophet dies, it is now haram. It is forbidden for that woman to marry again. So all of the wives that the Prophet had, once the Prophet left this world, it was actually forbidden for them to remarry after the death of the Prophet. So these women, they knew what they were getting into when they basically married Rasulullah. And had they known that they would not have been able to get married again, then obviously that would have been one of the factors perhaps that would have had actually dissuaded them from marrying the Prophet. But we see that it was not, it wasn't of that personal nature why they were marrying the Prophet in terms of, any personal gain. It was of a spiritual nature. It was, to have that proximity to Allah, let's say, and to the Prophet that they hoped to attain. That they married the Prophet. So it was not for those reasons, again, that they entered into marriage with the Prophet, nor that the Prophet chose them as his wife. And last is we see that not two of the wives, at least of the prophet, were former slaves that he married, and they were basically freed. Had it been for any personal motives, any personal factors, again, the prophet would not have, first of all, needed to marry a slave. Because at that time, Islamic regulations, basically there was no marriage between a free man and a slave. If you owned a slave, they were your personal property. But the prophet marrying them and having them freed also showed us that it was not a personal agenda that the prophet had, that he was marrying not for sexual reasons, as again the Westerners claim, but rather he was actually doing it for another purpose within that particular time. And again, sometimes a lot of these things are difficult for us to grasp, but we have to put our minds 1400 years ago in a culture which was steeped in a sort of in a different structure of society than we are today. So the family structure was different. The marriage alliances were different. I mean, today marriages take place between men and women. Maybe you meet at high school or university and you fall in love and you get married. And obviously there's nothing wrong with that. But the time of the prophet, marriages, for the most part, were done to forge political alliances. So a person from one tribe would marry a woman from another tribe. I mean, there would have been a love factor there, or some, obviously, affection between the two, but it was also to bring tribes together. So now they entered into marriage, so now there's trading alliances, there's peace between the tribes. There's a lot of this, you could say social harmony being brought about through this sort of tribal mentality and tribal marriages. So that form of marriage is not something perhaps that we see today in our society. We don't really see that here in North America, although it might be there, for example, but on a whole, we don't see marriages happening to form an alliance between two families or to end wars or friction. But that was happening at the time of the prophet and in even other tribal regions. Even in Africa, for example, within traditional tribes, you'll see that also happening, that they'll marry from another tribe, and now they have an affinity between the tribes. So they can trade, they can come and go with them. There are peace treaties. So this is one of the things that we see at the time of the prophet. So again, to paint the prophet with a brush of the 21st century and how he led his life is not going to really result in a fruitful understanding of all of these issues of the life of the prophet compared to today's society. So some of the rationale that we have given why the prophet married multiple wives from many different backgrounds. I mean, he had one wife who was a Jewish convert. He had a wife who was from Egypt who was a Christian convert. He had a wife who was a slave who was freed. He had women, his wife obviously Khadija alayhi salam was from a family from the Quraysh, very powerful, very wealthy. He had wives of different backgrounds. They weren't obviously from all one lineage, they weren't all from one culture, they were many different backgrounds, many different tribes of Arabian Peninsula. So some of the reasons that we have, one is for political and diplomatic ties. Again, as we mentioned, that when the marriages would happen, it would be between not only two people, but it was a tribal event, between two groups. So now you're able to forge an alliance between different groups. And so now those tribes would be more willing to accept the prophet more willing to hear the call of Islam, and then obviously ultimately convert to the religion through their interaction with the prophet, or even others that were being married into that particular tribe. So it was a political and a diplomatic event also happening at that particular era. There's also religious and social undertones, that women were slaves and he would marry them and free them. It was to help those women who were widows, for example, for protection, women who were widows who other men did not want to marry, did not want to take care of, both physically and spiritually. They would come and they would sometimes even offer themselves to marry the prophet, and the prophet would accept, and that would also give that woman that comfort, that safety, that tranquility, knowing that there was somebody to take care of her. And also we see that the prophet would marry sometimes because he wanted to reverse incorrect beliefs within the society. So for example, in one of the instances where the prophet had an adopted son, meaning that he was an individual, Zayd, who the prophet was taking care of, and so he was looked upon as being the adopted son of the prophet, although in Islam we don't have a concept of adoption as the Western concept has, where you adopt a child and they take upon your name and all of that, and they don't know their birth parents. But there was this individual whom the Prophet took in and brought him up. And after he divorced his wife, Allah basically allowed him to marry her, to break that tradition or thought that if you had an adopted son, that you couldn't marry the ex-wife of your adopted son. So there was an issue there to reverse incorrect beliefs that people had. So we see that sometimes the Prophet would do that to, again, remove incorrect religious teachings that people had within themselves that would not allow them to enter in that sort of a marriage, thinking that it was a prohibition, but actually it was just a cultural prohibition that they had put upon themselves, and the Prophet wanted to remove that notion from their minds. Let me stop there before we go on to the third topic, and just see if there's any questions or comments upon the second portion we've spoken about. Yes? Mhm. Mhm. Okay. Mhm. I think also at that time, well, I mean, one of the big factors we saw is that although there was a Muslim community, obviously in that first 25 years, the numbers were very small, right? In Mecca, I mean, starting off with a handful of believers, right? And there were no wars happening at first of all, so you would not have had women who were, let's say, widows because of wars and fighting. But it was really only until the life in Medina where there were wars happening, men were being killed, maybe taken as slaves and losing their lives eventually that way, that there became more and more of a need for those women who are now losing their husbands to have that safety sort of with it for them. Right, so in Mecca, and in that time where the Prophet was married to Khadija alayhi salam, that wasn't a need there also. And I think also to one level, it also speaks to the nature of the Prophet, right? That for that 25 years, a monogamous relationship that he had with Khadija alayhi salam, perhaps he's also trying to show the Muslims that it is not about just marrying women just for the sake of that, right? He was showing that the ideal way in life would be a monogamous relationship. But then if a need would come up in life, then that was an avenue open to help in society. Again, if there are ample men, let's say, and if the men and women ratio was equivalent, then obviously we would never have an issue of having multiple wives for a man. But because of the time of the Prophet, we saw that wars were happening, men were dying. There maybe was also an imbalance in the numbers, that had to be used as a balancing structure, we can say, within their society, right? But when you get to Medina, then obviously the things are all changing at that time. So I think at that time is where the Prophet now needed to put that rule into practice by having multiple wives and also allowing also the community to have that limit as well. There. Yes. Yes. So Quran makes it clear when Allah says in the Quran that I think it's Surah Al-Ahzab chapter 33 where he says that وَأَزْوَاجُهُ أُمَّهَاتٌ, right? Allah says that the wives of the Prophet are the mothers of the believers. So generally speaking, that verse applies to all of the wives of the Prophet, that they are all mothers of the believers, as the Quran clearly says, whether they be as the wives that you mentioned or any of the other wives of the Prophet. Now, what does that mean? That's a different discussion, right? Because, just because the Quran says there that the wives of the believers, does that give them a special status? It does at one level, because the Quran makes it clear that, again in Surah Al-Ahzab chapter 33, Allah says that, O wives of the Prophet, that you are not like other women, right? And Allah makes it clear that if you do a good deed, you will be rewarded double for it, but if you do a bad deed, you'll have a double punishment upon you, right? And the reason why they have a double punishment is because now they have a higher status in society, because people look to them as a wife of the Prophet. So they would expect a wife of the Prophet to be at a level of somebody who you should follow and emulate, right? So they are still mothers of the believers, but they have a greater responsibility to act in accordance with their status, I hope that helps. Mhm. 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 Okay. I mean, it's a bit off topic, but I'll just address it very briefly. Our Maraja have made it clear that it is not allowed to openly curse, to use the word la'nat, to vilify these individuals, especially in public, whether it be Aisha, the Khulafa, whoever they be. Because of the fact that they are respected by the majority of the Muslims, we're told that we're not allowed to openly vilify and denigrate them in that particular way. Now, if you want to look at it from a historical point of view, I mean, Muslims can have a discussion based upon historical texts, what happened with these individuals and where we feel they were not correct in their submission to Allah, right? Whether it be, for example, fighting the battle of Jamal against Amir al-Mu'mineen. I mean, we can debate that from a historical perspective and show, historically speaking, and from the hadith, that these individuals were definitely erred and not right. Right? But I mean, the scholars make it clear to us. Ayatollah Sistani has clear fatwa. Ayatollah Khamenei has a clear ruling that to openly use those sorts of words against these individuals is not allowed for a believer. But definitely, I mean, we can enter into discussion with non-Shias and say, look, historically we have problems with these people, and these are the reasons why. And we can bring historical facts up, and we can debate that in a civil manner, right? And we can have our own thoughts about these people, but we need to do it logically, I think, right? And understand why we have differences with these particular historical figures. But just to openly go and use those sorts of language against them, it doesn't serve our community and doesn't serve really the Muslim community, generally speaking. It doesn't give us really any benefit, especially at this time that we live in today. Okay. Mhm. So, I mean, you can do it at home. You don't have to do it in the public streets downtown, and again, I mean, we have to think about it, right? I mean, we have to think that the Prophet and Imams didn't just come for us to laugh and to cry over them and to engage in that way. I mean, we have them as role models for a specific purpose, right? And to learn lessons to make our life better as well. I mean, that is why the Prophet and Imams came and they suffered and they went through ups and downs in life. It's for us to learn lessons within our own lives. So I mean, if we're able to study their history and to see where these people went wrong, it's going to make a better life for us, but also then we're able to really convey that to other people who would be following them, right? So it's not just about increasing their punishment or this or that. I mean, that is a separate issue on its own. If that isn't a valid response, but I think just the fact that we can't live in a society where we're cursing one another, right? I mean, if you see what's happening in Iraq, for example, every day 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 100 people are being killed. Right? Afghanistan, Shias are being killed en masse. I mean, people from Pakistan go to Iran for ziyarat and they're killed in a bus because their name is Ali or Hussein. And there's actually documented proof. There's a specific religious scholar, quote unquote, of Kuwaiti origin in London, England, who openly curses these individuals. And there was an attack against some Shias in Iraq about 2 years ago, and a huge number were killed. And after they were killed, it was made known on the internet that we killed these Shias because of your sheikh in London. Right? So 200 Shias are killed because of somebody in England who has a satellite TV station who's cursing these individuals. So where is the benefit in that? Right? Now he has the blood of 200 Shias on his hands because of the things that he says, and he's being protected by the government of London, of England, and he's receiving millions of dollars to build his center. And he lives in comfort and luxury, and people are being killed, are being innocently killed around the world. So so you get some thawab on one end, but you've been responsible for killing 200 people. So how does that, equate to any goodness happening to the community, right? So, there's a time and place for everything. Even if you look at Ziyat Ashura, for example, which we accept as a part of our belief system. Ziyat Ashura, we believe is a hadith al-Qudsi taught by Allah to the Imams. You don't see, except for the names of certain people, you don't see, for example, Ziyat Ashura mentioning names of people who are responsible, right? You see, yes, you see Yazid, you see Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad, you see, Ali Abu Sufyan, you see these people, but you don't see Allah telling the Imams to mention other names of people. So we have to be a bit more wise and diplomatic, and we have to also realize that, logically speaking, why these people, why we, if we have issues with them, we need to discuss it at a historical level, right? And prove to other people, other non-Muslims, that yes, we have problems with these people, but it's not based on a personal grudge, but there are historical proofs for why we differ with with you on your understanding of them. Yes. Mm-hmm. 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 Yes. Sure. That's a very long one, actually, because that is, the majority of Muslims, although there is, even within the Sunni community, there is a difference of opinion nowadays. Historically speaking, even in the hadith, for example, in Sahih Bukhari and other hadith sources, they quote hadith that Aisha was, for example, 6 years old when the marriage happened and 9 years when the marriage was consummated. And our scholars, first of all, they reject that notion. Even a lot of mainstream Sunni scholars say that she was anywhere from 22 up to 28 years old. And they have a lot of arguments in hadith and in historical chains that prove this fact. So definitely at one level we have to say that the nine age is rejected by a majority of Muslims, I would say. So he didn't marry her when she was that young. So if the Prophet was, let's say, around 50, 55, she would have been, if we accept even the estimate of 22 or 25, at one level that does bring the debate a bit more closer, because although a 25-year age gap, it's still significant, but it's not something which is out of the ordinary. Even in today's day and age, you have men who are 50, 60, 70 years old in North America who marry women who are 18, 22, 25 years old, right? Not to say that that's right from either point of view, but it is a societal norm today. So definitely, we have to again look through those sources which debate and which analyze the historical text to see how old she actually was, and basically base it upon that. But at the same time, I also mentioned that if she was that young, that we have to understand it from the point of the Arab culture at that particular time, right? So if we look at Amir al-Mu'mineen, for example, his marriage to Fatima Zahra alayhi salam, he was 25, and at most she was 12 or 13 years old, at maximum, when she was married to Imam Ali. So if Muslims, if people say, well, the Prophet married Aisha at a younger age of, let's say, half of his age, Amir al-Mu'mineen, we could say the same thing about him, and that he was 25 and Fatima Zahra was 10, 12, 13 years old. But again, we need to go back to the fact that life at that particular time in Arabia was different. Women may have become more physically mature and mentally mature at a much younger age than today. Right? So a woman at 12 years old in Arabian culture could have been as a woman of 25 today, both physically from her physical point of view and her physique, and also from the mental perspective, that she's now ready to get married at that particular age. And even on today, there are certain cultures, even in the world today, where women mature quite quickly. Canada might not be one of them in terms of the indigenous population, but there are other cultures in which women become much more physically and mentally mature at a younger age. So definitely, we have to, there are a lot of proofs and discussions for the age of Aisha. How old was she actually when the Prophet married her? We need to really look through those in detail, and also look at it from the perspective of the culture of Arabia at that particular time as well. But just to also answer the one last point about what we see happening in the Muslim world, where you may have a man who is 60 or 70 marrying a girl of that age. Again, Islamically, I mean, especially from the point of view of the teachings of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam, we know that marriage basically is there's two conditions for marriage from the point of view of our scholars, right? One is mental maturity and one is the physical maturity. So you may have, for example, a man or a woman who are physically mature, they reach the age of becoming baligh, but mentally they're still not mature. They're still young kids, they're playing around or whatever. So just because they've reached the age of maturity doesn't mean that they are now, you have to go off and get them married at whatever age. So marriage is not just physical maturity, reaching the age of 9 or 15 or 14 or whatever, but you have to be mentally mature as well to take on that responsibility. And also one of the clear rulings in our religion is that there has to be an open tacit approval on behalf of the man and the woman to marry. So the father cannot just marry off his daughter to somebody because he feels she's ready. She has to verbally agree to that marriage. And if she doesn't, that marriage is actually forbidden. It's not allowed to engage in that sort of a marriage. So again, that is another thing that we have to say is that, at least from the point of view of Islam, as taught by Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam, that we have clear guidelines, even in terms of marriage, of the age and of the permission to be there, and that the woman has a right to accept or reject anybody who comes to ask for her hand in marriage. Yes. So the other prophets in the Quran, their wives are not introduced as mothers of the believers, but Allah does speak about the other wives of the Prophet, right? So for example, Allah talks about in, I believe it's Surah Tahrim, chapter 66, Allah talks about the wives of Prophet Lut and Prophet Nuh. And Allah says that, that they were under the care and supervision of 2 of our righteous servants. And then Allah says that they were basically unfaithful. They didn't act in pure sincerity to their prophets, to their husbands who were basically prophets of Allah as well. And so Allah actually orders them to the hellfire in the Quran as wives of the Prophet, right? But then Allah compares them and contrasts these 2 wives of a prophet to the wife of Pharaoh, of Asya, her name was. And she was married to Pharaoh, who was one of the worst people, but yet she is given paradise, right? So the Quran does make a distinction that just being a wife of a prophet does not mean that you are automatically guaranteed paradise, right? It's based upon the actions of the individual. So if Allah can say that the wives of Prophet Nuh and Lut are going to hell and they will be punished, it shows us that no prophet is really immune. No wife of a prophet is immune from punishment from Allah. And there are other examples in the Quran, but those are 2 of the clear examples in Surah Tahrim, where Allah basically shows us that a wife of the Prophet is not, having that title does not guarantee salvation in this world or in the next world. Yeah. Yes? Well, if she was 28, according to the hadith and the historians who have argued this point, obviously she would have been then, yes. Why she did something wrong, meaning, sorry. Mhm. Okay. Correct. No, I mean, mentally ready meaning somebody who is, has mental awareness, who is able to take care of themselves. That doesn't mean that they are infallible or that they don't make mistakes. Being mentally mature is different than a person who sins, right? You can be mentally mature and still commit a sin or do something wrong, right? So they're two separate things. Mentally mature meaning that, a person is that ability to decide good and bad, right from wrong for themselves. So that would be one level, but committing a sin or breaking a law of Allah would be at a different level. So many people who are mentally mature, who are intellectual, so-called intellectual speaking, they can still commit sins or break laws of Allah and do things which are not mentally, or which are not sound from a logical point of view. Yeah. Yes? Sure. Okay. Do you want to have that question or no? Yes. Mhm. Yes, in Egypt. Yes. Mhm. 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 Correct. Mhm. 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 Yes. Mhm. Mhm. Yes. Mhm. 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 Yeah. Yeah, I mean, if again our Maraja are clear on this topic, right? Sayyid Sistani and Sayyid Khamenei and many other Maraja have come out clearly and mentioned that to curse these individuals is not allowed, right? I mean, to enter into debate and discourse from an argumentative with proof from hadith and history, that is one issue. But just to go out and openly use these terms is, I mean, it only causes more problems for us as individuals and as a community in general. Yeah. I'll also just mention that I'll give the principal a website address, but I've translated a book recently on the issue of la'nat, on cursing the Sahaba and the wives of the Prophet. It looks at it from the historical point of view, and different arguments in terms of what is allowed from Islam and not. But I'll send you the link and you can send it out to the community. It's a short book of about maybe 40 or 50 pages, but it goes through a pretty exhaustive discussion on this particular topic, and hopefully it'll add benefit to the community for that. So I'm going to go to the third part of our discussion now, which is on the appointment of a successor to the Prophet. So we know that one of the key differentiating factors explicit in nominating a successor for himself, not only once or twice, but many times within his prophetic career. But the difference or the challenge lies now is, how do the Muslims interpret these words of the Prophet? How do the Muslims understand the words of the Prophet where he talked about a successor? And how do we answer, or what proofs do we have to say that the Prophet did leave a successor for the community of the believers? There's three actually areas of discussion here. And I won't go through them in detail, but just to give you some highlights on the area. So the first is about Quran and succession. That what does the Quran say about what happens after a prophet dies? Because we know that the Quran, Islam generally, we're told that we have 124,000 prophets. Of those, 28 are mentioned by name in the Quran. And in addition to the 28, many of them are also spoken about as having one who comes after them as a successor. Either being a prophet, for example, with Prophet Yaqub, and having Yusuf and others that come in his lineage, or Ibrahim and Ishaq and Ismail. So at one level, prophets, there are historical bases of where a prophet would have another prophet as a successor. But there are times in the Quran where a prophet is succeeded by not by another prophet, but by an imam, right? So, for example, in the case of Rasulullah, we have the issue of leadership, of succession, but that is not a prophet coming after the prophet, but it is an imam, and so we have to see that what does the Quran say, that are there historical Quranic injunctions of what happens when a prophet leaves this world. And another question that we have to answer is there a need for a leader after the prophet? And again, if you look at it from the Quranic perspective, we could see, well, are there verses of the Quran that say that a prophet has to have a successor? Or is there a need for a leader for a community once the prophet leaves? For that level, again, and the verses are many, I don't have really the time to go into a lot of the detail today. But we do see that the Quran shows us that almost every instance in where there is a prophet, that there is a successor for the prophet. Whether it be even Prophet Adam, the first human being and the first of the prophets of Allah, somebody comes after him. Even if there is they're geographically not in the same location, we also appreciate that prophets can come in different areas. So they don't all have to be in one region. They can be in different regions on the earth. There can be more than one prophet at one time upon the earth for different areas. But one of the general notions that we have is that every prophet leaves a successor behind him. So Ibrahim has Ismail and Ishaq, Yaqub has Yusuf, and other prophets that come after him. Musa, his successor temporarily was Harun, but Harun passes away, so Yusha ibn Nun is a successor of Prophet Musa. So all of these prophets within the Quran, we see that all of them will leave behind somebody to carry on their mission and their message. Sometimes their prophet would just continue the same teachings as the previous prophet, and other times their prophet would bring a new set of teachings or a new book or new code of conduct for their particular followers. So there is a Quranic understanding that each prophet does have a successor, and there's also a Quranic understanding that there is always a need for a leader for a society. And this is nothing even new, even in our society today in the Western world and in the secular world, we all appreciate that there has to be a leader for the society. You have, city council, you have a mayor who is in charge of all the city councilors. You'll have a provincial premier, and there will be ministers of the provincial parliament. You have a prime minister of a country, and then you have all of the people who are elected to be in the parliament. So in every level of government, even, you have leadership. You have people who are under the main leader, but you ultimately have one leader at all levels of a political system. If Islam is a political system in addition to a religion, then also that stands to reason that there has to be leadership of this particular political establishment. But the challenge now comes is, how do you identify who that leader is? And I'm going to just give you a few examples in the next slide, inshallah. So the main point really of contention amongst the Muslims is what happens after the death of Rasulullah. Some Muslims believe that, well, there is no successor, so the Muslims are free to choose who they want. It's an open and free democratic election. Others say no, that there has to be a direction given to us by Allah, because as Allah gives the prophethood to prophets, that divinely appointed leadership, similar does Allah choose who the successors of a prophet are. So how does this issue come into being? Is it a succession? Is it an election? Is it an appointment? Is it a constitutional decision, referendum? How does Islam basically see it to be a leader of a community? And so after the Prophet, which is what I want to look at right now, is we have to understand that how does the situation of the Muslims evolve after the death of Rasulullah? And the only way we can really appreciate that is to look at it from the Quranic perspective. Again, by collecting all of the verses of the Quran about leadership appointed by Allah. Look at the hadith at how did the Prophet define leadership of the Muslim community. Again, not just leadership of a community for a few days, but for all of eternity. Because again, if Islam is for all ages until the end of time that we know it, then there should be teachings on this. And also keep history in mind, that what happened in the terms of history and what was happening at the time of the Prophet that basically formulated what we see in today's day and age. So there are actually three ways of succession that we see in the history of Islam. And I've taken all of this from a website called alim.org, which is a non-Shia website. So we know that the Prophet, 23 years he had his prophetic mission. And from the mainstream, the non-Shia point of view rather, when they look at the succession to the Prophet, they say, well, the Prophet died and he left behind no successor. He just died and there was never a thought of who should come after him, who should take on the responsibility of running and guiding the community. And so on this website, they quote as saying that at the death of the Prophet, they said that the death of the Holy Prophet led to an immediate crisis in the affairs of the Muslims over the question as to who was to be the leader of the Muslims after the Holy Prophet. Thus, Abu Bakr was elected as the successor to the Holy Prophet on the very day of the death of the Holy Prophet. So if you study history, you'll realize that after the Prophet passed away, even before he passed away actually, there was a military campaign which the Prophet had asked an individual named Usama to lead. Usama was a young man of between 18 to 22 years old, and the Prophet made him the head of the battalion, and he told a group of the companions to go with Usama to this military excursion. Some of them, namely the first and second Khalifa as we know them today, went with him to a distance, and when they realized that the Prophet was very ill, they actually said, you know what, we're going to go back and be with the Prophet. So they basically disobeyed the Prophet's commands at level 1. So they came back to Medina. The Prophet, according to historical books, was very upset with them. And so they were present in Medina as the Prophet was passing away. The Prophet dies, and as we know, Amir al-Mu'mineen and the close family were busy preparing the Prophet's body for burial. And these individuals had gone to an area called Saqifa of Bani Sa'ida. Saqifa being like a tented area of the tribe of Bani Sa'ida. And they went there to debate and decide who would be the leader now that the Prophet had passed away. And it's a huge historical discussion. I won't go into the specifics. But the outcome of it was basically that Abu Bakr was elected by a handful of people who were there, maybe 30 to 50 people, probably no more than 100, that he would be the successor of the Prophet. So Imam Ali wasn't there. Members of the other close members of the family weren't there. Majority of the companions weren't even there. Maybe only, again, a maximum of 100 people. So this is what they say that happened, that Abu Bakr was basically elected to be the successor of the Prophet by whoever was there. It wasn't a democratically formulated election. But that's okay if that's what they want to do. We say fine. They said that the Prophet was not wise enough, a'udhu billah, that he didn't leave a successor, but they said Abu Bakr, he was smarter, and so he chose this method of appointing a successor, or him being appointed as the successor to the Prophet. But then when Abu Bakr is about to leave this world, he changes things a bit. And they mentioned on the site, they said that realizing that his end was drawing near, Abu Bakr felt that he should nominate his successor, so that the issue should not be a cause of dissension amongst the Muslims after his death. But it's interesting that Abu Bakr would nominate his successor, but the Prophet never did that. Well, if it was so important to have a successor, why did the Prophet not nominate somebody, even as Abu Bakr, as his successor? But he didn't do it. So at the first level, you have an election, and then the second level, you have a selection of one person. That one person says, I am deciding that this person will be my successor. So they said that Abu Bakr, he dies, and he appoints Umar to be his successor after his death. But now things get a bit interesting, because the first one was election, then selection. At the third level, what Umar does is he chooses to use a consultative assembly. So the website mentions that when Umar was on his deathbed, he was asked that he should nominate his successor. And Umar sighed and said, whom should I nominate? Whom should I nominate as my successor? When pressed to leave some guidance for the people to choose a successor, Umar said he would nominate a committee. And basically what happened in this committee is that Umar chose 6 people. 6 people were in the committee, including Imam Ali alayhi salam. And Umar basically said, in summarizing it, that you 6 people are now charged to nominate who will be my successor. But he put a bit of a twist on things, because he basically said that if you have 3 people on one side who vote for one person, 3 on the other side, then you have a tiebreaker. If you have 4 people on one side and 2 on the other side, the one whom the 4 people chose, he should be chosen, and the other 2 people who voted the other way, they should be killed. They should be killed, he says. And if there's a 5-to-1 vote, choose the one who chose 5 and kill the 6th person. This is in the history of Tabari, who is a non-Shia. He quotes this event. So here we ask a question that, first of all, the Prophet, they say, wasn't wise enough to choose a successor. So they have an election in Bani Saqifa. And then Abu Bakr, he becomes wise all of a sudden, and he chooses Umar as his successor. So he makes a selection. And now Umar brings a committee of 6. But the committee is so it's skewed because his cousins are on it, first of all, and his close friends are on it at one level. Uthman is on it, for example. But he brings this caveat where if there is a dissension, then you kill the people who dissent. But these are Sahaba of the Prophet. These are companions that they call to be noble companions, but yet he was saying that you kill them if they don't vote one way. So we see that there's 3 different ways of succession. And what is the right way? Would it be that Allah would leave a religion up to this sort of a process, that you just pick and choose who you want to lead a community? Clearly, Umar says that he did not want this to be a cause of dissension amongst the community and for the community to fracture. So if he had so much wisdom to not want the community to separate, does that mean that the Prophet did not have that wisdom to want the community to separate? Obviously not, because we accept the Prophet as being the Prophet of Allah, and that whatever he would have brought in would be for the betterment of a community. So we have to look somewhere between the lines and to look at what actually is the true nature of succession of the Prophet. There are, and again, unfortunately time won't permit me to go through all of the verses. We'll have to keep that for another discussion. But there are so many verses of the Quran that point and give us a reference to the leadership of the community after the Prophet. There's nothing specific. So if somebody comes and says to you, prove to me from the Quran that Imam Ali was a successor of the Prophet, the first successor after the death of the Prophet, by name. Well, we can say that there are no verses of the Quran which mention Imam Ali by name in the Quran. There are no verses. Allah did not say in any verse of the Quran that Imam Ali is the successor of the Prophet after his death. It's not there in the Quran. And then people will say, aha, see, there's no verse, so we can do things as we want to decide. But we also have to appreciate that we don't just follow the Quran, right? We don't just say, okay, the Quran says it, so we do it, or the Quran doesn't say it, and we don't do it. If that was the case, then a lot of what we follow today, we wouldn't be doing, right? Something as simple as prayers that we do 5 times a day, the Quran doesn't tell you and I how to pray. It doesn't say, for example, do your niyat, takbiratul ihram, and then the surahs, and then ruku. It doesn't tell us any of that. So how do we pray? And no Muslim will not pray, or will say that, we don't pray. But they say that we follow how the Prophet prayed. Even something like when a person dies, we give the ghusl, we do the kafan, we bury the body facing Mecca. There is no verse of the Quran that says you have to do any of that. We could just as easily as, cremate the body like our Hindus do, the Hindu community does, and end the funeral like that. But we go through the process of washing the body, of wrapping it in the white cloth, of doing the salatul mayyat, of making it face towards Qibla, and then we bury the body. But the Quran doesn't tell us any of that. So why do we do it? We do it because the Prophet showed us how to do that particular action. So everything in the Quran, or everything in Islam, is not expressly mentioned in the Quran. The generals are mentioned in the Quran, and then the specifics are left to the Prophet to explain to the community. And successorship is one of those things. The Prophet, or the Quran rather, doesn't say that Imam Ali is a successor of the Prophet. But there are many verses that we have to look at all together in a holistic point of view to see how we get the understanding that Imam Ali is the successor of Rasulullah. So whether we look at, first of all, the infallibility of the Imams, which is proven by verse 33, Surah 33, verse 33, Ayat of Tathir, we understand that the Ahlul Bayt are immaculate, are infallible, they have been protected from sinning. Or we look at verses of the Quran, for example, which talk about the wali, or the master of the community, and who it is. So for example, in chapter number 5, where Allah says, إِنَّمَا وَلِيكُمُ that indeed your wali is Allah, وَالرَّسُولُ and the Rasul, وَالَّذِينَ آمَنُوا الَّذِينَ يُقِيمُونَ الصَّلَاةَ وَيُؤْتُونَ الزَّكَاةَ وَهُمْ رَاكِعُونَ. That Allah says, indeed your wali, which we have to also define, is Allah, and the Prophet and those believers who وَالَّذِينَ آمَنُوا الَّذِينَ يُقِيمُونَ الصَّلَاةِ perform the salat and give the zakat while they're in the state of ruku, we have to look at that verse of the Quran from a historical perspective to see when was that verse revealed. If we know who the verse was revealed about, then we can go back and say, well, the word wali, it has different meanings. It means friend. It means a close companion. It means a slave. It means a master. It means so many things in the Arabic language. But we look at it in the context of how it was revealed, and then we apply that verse to Allah, the Prophet, and who that third group of individuals are. So successorship of the Prophet is a very important topic, because again, this is the key factor of what differentiates the majority of the Muslims today. And for Muslims to say, well, there is no Quranic mandate is first of all incorrect, because there are direct ayat that talk about Allah appointing successors of previous prophets, so we have to look at that aspect. We have verses of the Quran that talk about wilayat, about mastership of certain individuals, whether it be the verse that I mentioned from chapter 5, or any of the other ayat that Allah talks about who our masters and our protectors are. And also we have to look at those same hadith from the historical perspective, that why were those verses revealed? What was happening? What was the Prophet talking about? And ultimately, and this will be coming up next week, is the Eid of Ghadir on the 18th of Dhul Hijjah, which is where the Prophet made the final, or most vocal rather, proclamation of the wilayat of Imam Ali. And this is not a hadith that anybody can doubt, because it is mentioned in all of the books of Muslims. If you look at the books of the Shia, it is in many of our hadith books. If you go to even the Sunni sources like Sahih Muslim, for example, if you go to, in the English version, which is a book number 4, in the chapter of the Fadilat of the Sahaba, there's a chapter on the Fadilat of Imam Ali, and the hadith of Ghadir is mentioned in there. And in it actually, the author of Sahih Muslim, he actually quotes the hadith of Thaqalain, of the Prophet leaving behind the Quran and the Ahlul Bayt. And so there are clear even hadith in non-Shia sources of the event of Ghadir, of even Imam Ali being appointed as the Mawla, and how even in the Sunni hadith that Umar is the first person who comes to Amir al-Mu'mineen and he says, congratulations, O son of Abu Talib, today you have become the Mawla, the master of every believing man and every believing woman. And he's the first person to shake the hand of Imam Ali on the day of Ghadir. Again, there are many ayat of the Quran. There's the actual verse of the Quran about Ghadir, and then the historical context behind it. But in all of these, we see that the Prophet was clear and explicit in nominating a successor through the orders of Allah, and that he didn't leave it up to the community to make that decision after him, because as we see from the Khulafa, that they were themselves scared of a fracture within the community. And if they had it within their wisdom to appoint a successor for their own mission, then how can we say that the Prophet would not be that wise, and that Allah would not be wise enough to know what would happen, and that he would leave the community to go into error and not to have a leader that they should follow after the death of the Prophet? I'm going to end there, and we'll have a few questions on this topic before we go to the final part of the discussion for today. Yes. Sahih Muslim. It's book number, in the English version, it's book number 4. It's 4 volumes, and there's a chapter called the status of the Sahaba, of the companions. And within that book, there's a sub-book, which is the Fadilat of Imam Ali, and the hadith is within there. Yeah. Yes.
Yes, as you mentioned, there are very good reasons that deviate as why we go fundamentally, and this happened many times that when I had the arguments with my Sunni colleagues and brothers, I always had the same issue. And I asked them that when you call yourself Sunni, we expect that you would follow Sunnat Rasulullah. At the time of the death of Rasulullah, these 3 events happened. The first Khalifa was elected, the second one was selected, and the third one was among 6 people. That even the order was to kill all of them, there was no confusion, and go for whoever you want,
Yes.
which the second Khalifa. And then when they bring this stuff, their argument, at least one of them that I know he is following the Wahhabism, he told me Of course. I said, and I know that many of my Sunni brothers call Hazrat Ali alayhi salam the best amongst them. Karamullah, like he is the only one whose face was not worshipped against an idol.
Yes.
So I said, when you have this God, how come when Ali ibn Abi Talib became alayhi salam became the Khalifa, and he asked Muawiyah to step down from his governorship, he did not accept. How come you call him Amir Muawiyah? And how come when the war of Siffin happened, that more than 90,000 people were killed? Who is responsible for that? How come? And of course, at that moment he was silent. I said, brother, the thing is that you don't study, and I have seen it many times. When you talk to them, at least to me, they always say, "Oh, mashallah, you're not." I said, "No, it's not mashallah. I'm not. The thing is that we care about this stuff. Because through their understanding, this is what he told his brother. He said, when I die, in the first night of my grave, I will be asked, who is my God, who is Allah, what book I follow, what prophet I follow. They would never ask me if Ali was right or Muawiyah was right. I said, okay, it's up to you now. But I have fundamental questions for you that from day one, you just prove to me which one of these three ways was going to trust your God. In the Caliph election, selection, is giving, as you said. It's beautiful comment that you have. And at the same time, if the Khalifa was obvious to be followed, it was mandatory for people. As brothers ask questions here about this lady, whose name is Aisha. The thing is that about Aisha, when we have the verses in Quran about Mu'mineen, we have to continue. It says that you are the wives of Prophet, you are different from your women. You should stay at home because there are men who have maraz, who have some problems that they might do something against you. The question now is, when Aisha went and waged war against Ali ibn Abi Talib, who was Khalifa of her time, for sure he was Khalifa of her time.
Correct.
People didn't hear her voice, people could not see her as one, so she didn't follow that one. And at the same time, there is a hadith that all Muslims believe in, that if somebody dies, doesn't know her or his Khalifa or Imam of the time, or his time, her or his death will be the death of Jahiliyyah. The question that I always have for these people is that when Aisha did this against Imam Ali, who was the Khalifa of her time? So, and always there's silence.
Yes.
I mean, maybe unfortunately, because I need these questions to be answered because of my own, thought. There is no answer. So I just wanted to touch upon,
Yes.
and appreciate what you said.
Sure.
In addition to that, this is stuff that are always, at least discussed, and we have good arguments.
Correct. Yeah. Thank you. Yes.
What's the verse number where the verse came where the Imam Ali gives his ring in the ring?
It's let me see if there's a Quran here. It's chapter number 5. 555, I think it might be.
Is it 555?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, 555. إنما وليكم الله ورسوله والذين آمنوا الذين يقيمون الصلاة ويؤتون الزكاة وهم راكعون. Yes.
On the YouTube, I always listen to a lady. She has PhD in Sharia, and also she was Sunni.
Okay.
Because for the research, she talks a lot about Shia and how Ali alayhi salam is the imam and so on. Then she mentioned that Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when in Eid al-Fitr in Ghadir Khan, when he waited for people for Hajj, then some people already left.
Yes.
Some people start, not coming yet. That's all. Then he mentioned everybody should back. Then the one who didn't come, waited for them. The one already left, they have to come back.
Correct. Yes.
But it's very important event. It's not the first time we mention about Imam Ali. Many times, but specifically that time has to be the last one in the khutbah to Wada.
Yes.
When he said the reason, and now they prove it scientifically why Prophet Muhammad will choose that place. Why he didn't say it in, like in Hajj or something.
Yes.
Because he said there is 3
Uh-huh.
spread the sound, the voice.
Uh-huh.
And that's 100,000 people
Yes, yeah.
because they, able
To hear it.
that Prophet Muhammad said that Subhanallah, he's a prophet, that specific place
Yes.
very important to talk about Wilayat Ali, and even 100,000 people can
Hear him.
what he said.
Correct, yes.
He said it's proved now.
Mm-hmm.
They did it.
Inshallah.
Then it's very
Important, yes. Yes, yeah. Any other questions on this topic before we just end off with the last part of the discussion for today? So I'll go to the last discussion, last part for the presentation for today. And we'll just get the slide up there. And that is on how we can promote the cause of Islam. So what can we do in our current era to ensure that the correct message has been given to those of our community, our family, our friends, who are obviously not hearing what it is that Islam speaks about, whether it be what we've talked about today, or really any aspect of the religion. Unfortunately, obviously, we have a huge media apparatus in front of us, whether it be internet, television, satellite, all the forms of media which do not obviously give the correct message of Islam. And unfortunately, we don't perhaps have the ability as a collective body to launch movements that other groups do. But there's obviously little things that we can do as individuals that we can always work upon to convey this message. Before that, I want to share with us a hadith which is very interesting. Actually, Ayatollah Sistani mentions this hadith in his book, A Code of Practice for Muslims Living in the West. And it's basically this discussion that happened at the time of the sixth Imam about whether the companion should live in a Muslim country, a so-called Muslim country, or if he has the right to travel and migrate to other parts of the world at that time. And so the companion, whose name was Hamad al-Sindi, he says to the Imam, he says that I visit the cities of polytheism, meaning the non-Muslim countries. And he says, and there are some amongst us who say that if you die over there, that you'll be raised in the hereafter along with them. The Imam asks him, he says that, oh Hamad, when you are over there in non-Muslim countries, he said, do you talk about our affair, meaning our religion, about the truth, and call the people to it? And he says, yes, I do that. Then the Imam says, when you're in those cities, the cities of Islam, do you talk about our affair and call people to us, to the Ahlul Bayt? And the man says, no, I don't do it. So when I'm in a non-Muslim country, he says, I teach your religion, but back home in the Muslim country, I don't tell people about you, the Ahlul Bayt. So the Imam says to him, he says that if you were to die over there in the land of non-Muslims, you would be raised up as an ummah by yourself, and there would be a light in front of you. Right? Showing that to live in the West is not haram, it's not forbidden for us to live here as Muslims. But there is an issue that if we're just living here for the monetary benefit, for the profit, for making good money and having an enjoyable life, and are not caring about religion, then there is a problem with that. Right? There is a religious problem with it, that we risk the chance of not only losing our dunya, but also the akhirah, which is much more important, losing our next life. But that we end up on the opposite end of this hadith, which is that we would not be raised up as an ummah, that we would not be raised up as a believer even, as the Imam shows us in this hadith. So it's not a problem living in these countries. Obviously, many of us were born here, myself including born in Canada. So there's no problem, born here, living here, having, generations living in these countries. But the issue comes is, what are we doing with our lives while we're here? Are we just living like everybody else? Going through school, going through all the levels of education to get the job to finance our exotic lifestyle, or are we also balancing that with a true concern for the religion and for the propagation of the religion? And it's not just about propagating to bring people to Islam, really. It's about making the society a better place, right? And that is really what we should be thinking about. It's not that I want all my friends to become Muslim just so the masjid is filled with people. No, we don't need Muslims like that. But really bringing true Islam to ourselves and bringing true Islam to the community around us actually benefits the entire society. A lot of the problems that we see out here today, you have people who are caught up in so many vices, whether it be drugs, alcohol, pornography,
getting caught up in so many things that are diversions. It's not only a diversion for them, but it affects the entire society. A person who drinks alcohol doesn't just affect himself, but then he goes in behind the wheel and he kills another person. There is now a huge damage right there for not only that person, but entire society. Even the issues of so many other social evils that we have. It doesn't just affect that one person, it affects all of society on a whole. So when we talk about spreading Islam, it's not just spreading Islam to make more people, to become Muslims, to make our centers more populous. It actually should result in a better society for everybody who lives within that world. And today people are so afraid of Sharia. They say, oh, we don't want Sharia in the West, and Sharia is about cutting off hands and killing people. And ultimately, Sharia is not about that. It is really about bringing normalcy to life. It is about bringing a sense of discipline and a sense of security within the life that we lead. It's completely opposite to what the media makes it out to be. But again, we have to understand those aspects of the religion and then to be able to convey those to the people. Just to give you, again, a very practical example that I personally faced a few years ago. That one of my co-workers, she had a bit of a difficulty in terms of money. She was living paycheck to paycheck, and she didn't have money 1 month for food or something. And so she asked me for some money to borrow, so I gave her an amount of money. And she said, I'll pay you back whatever in a month or two. I said, okay, whenever you can pay me back. And when she came to pay me back, or even before that, she's like, okay, you've lent me whatever it was, $200 or $500. She's like, how much do I have to pay you back? And I said, well, you borrowed $500, so you give me back $500. Well, she's like, well, but no, if I went to the bank or one of these, these payday loan centers, they'd charge me 23 or 28 or 40% interest, whatever it is that they charge. And I said, no, my religion does not allow me to charge you interest on a loan. You're in a difficult situation in your life. Why should I take advantage of you and take more money from you? And she was just blown away that Islam taught something like that you don't take advantage of people when they're in their most vulnerable situations in life, right? So she didn't become Muslim, but it's in her head now that Islam treats people with that level of fairness, that you don't, kick somebody when they're down, that you treat people with respect, that when people are in a difficult situation, you help them out. And that's just one example, right? If Muslims were to lead that kind of a life, or, simple things like you have people in downtown, I'm sure in Edmonton, people who are homeless, who don't have food. And you have Christians who have food banks, who have soup kitchens, who feed the homeless. Muslims, we don't do that. Unfortunately, maybe here we do, but on a whole, Muslims don't necessarily go into the inner cities and feed the homeless. But you look at the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam in Surah Insan, and they feed. وَيُطْعِمُونَ الطَّعَامَ عَلَى حُبِّهِ مِسْكِينًا وَيَتِيمًا وَأَسِيرًا. The Ahlul Bayt, they had people come to their door, the miskeen, the yatim, the poor person, the orphan, the war captive, and whatever food the Ahlul Bayt had that day to break their fast, they give that to the poor. They feed the homeless. They feed the war captive. They feed the orphans. Right? So if we were to put all of these things into practice, then we would have a different society around us. It wouldn't just be one or two people. It would be a whole community feeding the poor, making society better in that way. And when you feed the poor, then there's no need for them to go and steal. Why do people steal? For a lot of people, they steal because they don't have, right? They don't have food. They don't have things that they need. Yeah, there are people who steal for personal gain. But, as an example, we had a friend who was an African-American convert to Islam in America. This is in the early 80s or mid-80s. And before he became Muslim, he robbed a store. He went to a grocery store. His wife was pregnant. He didn't have any money for food. He went to a grocery store. He robbed it in America for some eggs and bread and just basic needs he had. He was convicted, sentenced to 25 years in prison. 25 years just for stealing some food. Nobody was killed. Nobody was hurt. But he had a gun and he had black skin. And those two are dangerous combinations in America today. He was actually due to be released just a few years ago, and just about a year before he was to be released, he actually died in prison. So he never even saw his son face to face. By pictures he saw his son, but he never actually saw his son that his wife was pregnant with when he did this robbery. Right? So he stole because it was out of desperation. But had communities been available that were providing food to him and to people who are in situations like that, he would not have been in the situation that he found himself in. And a lot of people are like that. So one of the things that we can do as Muslims is to really try and understand the religion at that level and try to live it on a day-to-day basis. It doesn't mean you wear a shirt that says I'm a Muslim, or you wear a baseball cap that says that you follow Islam, but you need to follow the teachings of the religion, right? Unfortunately, today you see the opposite. People look like Muslims outside, but they don't follow Islam. Just 2 days ago, I was reading an article in the British newspapers, and 6 Muslims were convicted of smuggling cocaine from Pakistan to England, worth, $350 million worth of cocaine and heroin and all these drugs. And their names are Muhammad and Hassan and Ali and all these Muslim names. And now they've just destroyed the name of Islam. Right? We know that they don't represent our religion, but when the non-Muslim media or non-Muslim reads the paper and he says, oh, this man named Muhammad was smuggling in cocaine from Pakistan, what are they going to think when they hear the name of Rasulullah, when they hear the adhan, and they hear the name of the Prophet? Right? They're going to associate the two together, just as unfortunately we do. We associate people of a different religion with actions that they perform. So what we have to do is we need to really be not people who just learn the religion, but we also have to live it at a practical level. And we have to really do that at multiple stages. One is obviously to learn the religion, whether it be the roots of our religion, what we learn here. But also we realize that madrasa is not the end all, meaning that when you guys leave today, Sunday, I don't expect you to close your books and throw them in your bag, and next Sunday again you open them up again, and you don't look at them the entire week. No, you guys should spend at least even 5 minutes a day. I'm not saying spend 2 hours reading your madrasa notes every day, but 5 or 10 minutes, even 1 page of what you've learned in madrasa. Read it, go home, spend 5 minutes every day. If you look at it, that's 30 minutes in a week. You can go through your entire lesson in over the course of the 6 days. So spend some time to learn refresh what you're learning over here. And if you have the ability and the time, then go further than that. There are many, useful websites, many useful videos on YouTube. We have satellite TV stations run by, sincere scholars who are providing, sound knowledge on the religion that you can benefit from. So you have to learn the religion, both the roots of the religion, also the philosophy and wisdom of Islam. Sure, it's easy for me to say it's prohibited for me to give or take interest, but I should know why. What is the rationale behind it? Why does Islam say that men and women should be separated in terms of interaction and mingling? Not that, that we have mixed functions and gatherings, but no, there is always a separation. And why is it there? Is it just to separate, or is there a rationale behind that? We should understand the wisdom of why we do all of these things. And also we should be able to have a practical look at comparing Islam to other traditions, not to put down Christianity or Judaism or these religions, but really, rather to compare them practically, that these are teachings that you are given, but this is what Islam says, and this is why Islam is more practical in today's day and age. Once we learn, obviously, we can then practice, and that is obviously why we come and learn. That's why we come to the majalis, that's why we come for madrasa, that's why we do all of the things of the religion, is to be able to actually put those things into practice on a day-to-day basis. So we should be able to live Islam in our day-to-day lives. Again, not just at work, or it's not just in the masjid, but when we go to work, when we go to school, we should be able to live the religion of Islam. A few years ago, I went to the bank in where I live, and I had some work to do, and I went to the agent, the financial agent, and it happened to be a woman. And so I went into her office, and she went to shake my hand, and I apologized. I said, I'm sorry, I don't shake hands with women or people of the opposite gender who I'm not related to. And she was okay with it. She said, no problem. She sat down, and I did my business transactions in the bank, and then she asked me, she asked me why what religion I follow, and why we don't have physical interaction between people of the opposite gender. And I explained to her very briefly. And she was a Christian woman. She had a cross around her neck. And she told me, she says that, I wish I had that religious teachings. She told me, I feel uncomfortable having to shake the hand of anybody who comes into my office, male. I don't want to, but I have to do it because of the job that I'm in. And she was a non-Muslim woman who had this, and she told this to me. So it shows me that there are people out there who want to lead a life that we lead, who want to live that life of humility and humbleness, but society doesn't let them. And even just recently, I think last week, I read an article about an American woman. She's a non-Muslim, Christian, very traditional, but she has decided to wear hijab full time in her life. She's actually written a blog about it too, and she says, I'm not Muslim. I don't want to disrespect Islam, but I feel wearing the hijab makes me more accepted and respected in society. So she's a non-Muslim who is, leading a life that, that many Muslims unfortunately don't lead, unfortunately. And she's a non-Muslim. She doesn't have to wear it, but she finds that hijab is a form for her to express herself as a human being and not to be as a sexual object within the society that she lives in. So we should try to live Islam day to day. When we go to school, when we go to work, when we have things are happening, we should always be ready to live Islam as a practical reality. Make Islam practical as well. Again, it's not just about coming to the masjid and praying, but we have to make Islam practical on a day-to-day basis. Again, how we interact with people, trying to put the teachings into direct application within our lives. And also to express our religious teachings openly, whether it mean praying on the plane, or praying in an airport, or praying in the park if it's the time, or any of the things that we are instructed to do. We need to be open about it. Maybe there was a time in North America when our parents first came to this country 20, 30, 40 years ago where it was difficult because the Muslims were so few in number. But today you see, even here, there's so many centers, so many Muslims, that you can't almost not help but see a Muslim. You go to the bank and there's bank tellers who are wearing the hijab. You go to the grocery stores, you go to almost anywhere, and there are Muslim men and women working in many different fields. And so they're expressing their religious teachings in an open fashion. And we should also be able to do that on a very practical level. Again, praying as a prime example, to pray outside when the time comes. If you're not able to make it home, or you don't have anywhere else to pray, then why not pray where you're able to? Again, there's nothing embarrassed or shameful about it. People may look at you strangely, but they're going to walk away and you'll probably never see them again. But that prayer of 3 or 4 minutes, which is an obligation, it may also have a huge impact on that individual and them coming to Islam, or if not even coming to Islam, at least appreciating the Muslims a bit better. And then third and finally, which we already covered, is to lead by example, to teach. So we learn, we practice, and then we have to teach to others within our community. Whether it be at an individual level where we practice what we preach of the religion, we be ambassadors for Islam at school, at work. Again, this is more of a recent phenomenon of having youth establishing, for example, like we have in many universities, we have these Thaqalain Students Associations on campus, where they have a group of Shia youth who form a student body for people of like mind, and they have religious events on campus and the like. That is also something that can be done, and having interfaith seminars and discussions. And then even having, for example, open houses and discussions here in the center. Invite the neighbors of the communities that we are in to come and learn about the religion, have discussions, have panels. Again, where I'm coming from, we have interfaith discussions where we have people of 18, 20 different religions. We come and we meet together on a monthly basis. We have Christians, we have Buddhists, we have Sikhs, we have people from the Jewish tradition. We even have people who are Wiccan pagans, right? People who of all different basically backgrounds. And we get together and we discuss and we openly talk about our similarities and even our differences. So that's also something that we can do, that we can invite the people that we live around to come and learn about the religion and to really see what it is that we practice and that we follow. And hopefully that can also be one of the ways to instill that respect for the people around us in the religion of Islam. Let me end there and just again ask if there's any questions or any comments even on this last point before we end the program for this afternoon. Yes?
I have to talk a little bit about that prayer because it's good because when you say to open to other people, also to practice Islam is good for individuals. Like say why we have to pray. Even Muhammad said if we are something of anger or something, go and pray to rak'ah. And now there is a doctor of the YouTube or always watching his speech, he's like saying talking. He said, then subhanallah, and especially like we pray on 7 like hands and
Yes.
7 body parts. And it said that 7 specifically here, then it
Mhm.
And he mentioned in the prayer, and he's not Shia,
Uh-huh.
mentioned the prayer should be nothing between the clay, like
Mhm.
turab,
Yes.
and between you, because it has to be contact with turab.
Uh-huh.
Subhanallah, that's
Subhanallah.
where the energy get out.
Mhm.
That is very important to remember. Next sajda has to be on the turban.
Yes,
And
yes.
that is, subhanallah, it's a proven now. And also about the prayer too. It said one doctor from Syria, Aleppo, he did the research and he proved it. He said that important to pray Jama'ah, and Prophet mentioned is equivalent of 27. If you pray like by yourself,
Yes.
and pray Jama'ah is 27. He said they measure the energy of person during the prayer of Jama'ah.
Okay.
Exactly number 27.
Mm.
That's its proof.
Yes.
Subhanallah, gives
Subhanallah.
your energy.
Yes.
It's very important. The Islam not only religion, but also knowledge.
Yes.
Part of
Correct.
Islam is knowledge, thinking. That's what God said. Always,
Always think.
think.
Correct, yes.
Then it's very important why we pray, because it's important for us.
Son.
Purify us.
Correct. Thank you very much. Yes. Comes first, meaning in what way? Like in terms of importance or? Mhm. Yeah. So, both are equally important, I would say. I mean, the Quran, so I guess we look at it at two different views in terms of the Quran and the Prophet. One is that obviously the Quran being the word of Allah, just the black ink on white paper. So that has its own importance, being the word of Allah. So obviously that has its own level of respect and reverence that we show. But then we have the Prophet, who basically is the interpreter of the Quran. Right? He explains the verses as the Quran. I mean, even in Surah Al-Jumu'ah, Allah mentions where He says, "Huwa alladhi ba'atha fil ummi'in rasulan minhum yatlu alayhim ayatihi wa yuzakkihim wa yu'allimuhumul kitaba wal hikmah." Right? That it is Allah who sent the Prophet amongst the ummi'in, the people of Mecca, with the book, and that he would read the book to them and purify the people. Right? He teaches the people the book and the wisdom. So the Quran obviously is the guideline for life. But we don't read the Quran and its understanding except with the teachings of the Prophet. So really both have to be mixed together. The Quran has its own level of respect and how we follow it. But for example, as Muslims, we don't say that I'll just open up the Quran and read a verse and act upon it. Right? Because there are verses of the Quran which, as the Quran says, that there are verses which are muhkamat, which are clear verses, and they're mutashabihat, verses which are not clear for just the common people to understand, right? And Quran even mentions that Allah says, يُذِلُّ بِهِ كَثِيرًا وَيَهْدِي بِهِ كَثِيرًا, that Allah leaves or people become misguided by the Quran, and also people become guided by the Quran. Depends on the person's niyat and their intention and how they read the Quran. So we have to appreciate that we read the Quran, but not on its own. We have to have the teacher to read the book and to give that respect to it. So I say both would actually go hand in hand together. Yes. Mhm. So Quran, I mean, yeah, the Quran itself even describes itself as a rahmatul lil mu'mineen and shifa. But also Allah says, for example, that Quran is hudan lin nas, right? The Quran also is a guidance for humanity. So even the Quran, when we read it, a non-Muslim can read Quran and receive hidayat, guidance from the Quran. A Muslim can read Quran and have shifa'at and have rahmah from it. So anybody who reads the Quran with an open mind can benefit from the Quran in some way. And obviously the Prophet is rahmatul lil alameen, he's a mercy for the universe. And obviously that rahmat, that mercy would come in different ways to humanity, just as the verse of the Quran can be appreciated by people at different levels and at different people at different levels within society. Yes. Oh, one more. Okay.
You were talking about how it's, you should pray every day.
Mhm.
So if you're traveling somewhere, how would you go about praying?
Yeah. So basically, the general understanding is that wherever we are, if the prayer time comes, and if we don't have the time, for example, to pray on stable land, we should pray wherever we are. So if you're flying from here to, let's say, Vancouver, and you know you'll reach the city in time to pray in the mosque or at home or the hotel, then you can delay your prayers if you need to till you get to the where your destination is. But if you're in a situation where you're flying and you're going to go over time zones and miss your prayers, basically what we do is try to face Qibla as possible. So a lot of times if you're flying, you can ask the stewardesses for room at the back of the plane to pray. And most times, actually every time that I've ever asked them, I've never had a problem with them allowing me to use the back of the plane. And I mean, usually they'll have a map on the plane with the directions, so you're able to tell roughly which way Qibla is in that way. And basically you just follow the prayers in that particular way. If you're in a situation where you can't stand up and pray, maybe they won't allow you to, there's no room on the plane or something, then we're told you can just sit in your chair, and if you can't even change to face Qibla, you just pray in the direction that you are. And then as a precaution is that when you get to where your destination is, it's just to make up that prayer again in the proper method. But at least once you pray on the plane, you've basically covered your responsibility, so there's no sin on delaying a prayer in that particular format. Yeah. So we'll, I think, end there with that last question. I wanted to again thank the madrasa first off for the invitation for today and for suggesting of the topic. And I wanted to thank all of the sisters and brothers for coming out today. And thank you for the questions. We will pass over this presentation also to the principal to get to all of you. There's some links also that we have in there, so hopefully there will be benefits of a benefit for all of you in that. And inshallah, we'll hope and pray that we can all be of those who follow the religion of Islam, that we can again be those ambassadors that we want to show the community that we live around of the beauty of Islam, and that we can follow our responsibilities to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to the Prophet, and to the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, wassalatu wassalam ala Rasulillah wa Ahli Bayti at-Tayyibin at-Tahirin.